She consciously thought that if they did shoot her, she would stay very still, so they wouldn't keep shooting her again.
Yeah, and okay. And of course, you have to understand that I was receptive to all of that. Now, it's all of those thought patterns also. Now, in her head, so to speak, because here we are talking for her and about her. All of those thoughts were realized and dealt with. But at this time, there was a spiritual receptivity on her part that allowed her to be comforted by universal spiritual knowledge, universal spiritual love. In other words, a very high degree of unconditional love. Now, what I'm trying to do is purposely not say that I was instrumental in giving that to her. Although, if you ask that, was I at all instrumental in giving any of that to her, I would have to say yes. But I don't want to take full credit for either being or manipulating or anything of that matter, because, in other words, here's the way of disqualifying myself, is that if I had not made any be clairvoyantly aware of the incident and telepathically at one minute with her during that time, even if it was a one-way telepathic rapport, she would have been dealt with spiritually and been given the spiritual hug anyway. In the highest of probabilities, that would have taken place every bit as intensively and for the cause and effect relationship that took place in her story. In other words, as she would tell the story if she was sitting here with us. And it doesn't disqualify any of her qualifications. It doesn't diminish or pollute or disturb any of her claims as to what she experienced or didn't experience.
So in other words, she received what was spiritually appropriate for her, and that would have happened because.
Yes, because of she being who she was, and knows, or it is constantly automatically due everybody. This isn't something you suddenly earn, although you could use that same sentence in another dialogue. It's available to everybody, and it does not require another human being to facilitate that for you. It can come directly from the light. It can come from God. It is in the ethers. It is always there. Universal unconditional love is always there for every one of us all of the time. And only we pollute and diminish ourselves from that. And that if we simply stop doing that, we will automatically experience. We are already justified and qualified to experiencing that unconditional love, which often is first perceived as this glorious hug, or this everything is going to be okay, or everything is okay. I mean, here you are getting physically beat up and traumatized and threatened with a disgusting death. And it can, even that dilemma situation, it can suddenly be okay, as crazy as that sounds. Because again, to question me farther and say, Tom, are you saying that to know that you're about to get shot in the head and killed, you're going to say that you know that, well, I'm about to be shot in the head and killed, and it's really okay? The answer is, yeah. And that takes place. Well, she still realized that she had to do with her own free will, in other words, her own basic free will to live, the survival instinct, as well as her conscious or superconscious awareness that this might be survivable, that methodically and physically she should do several things, certainly not agitate these terrorists any further, because things will only get worse. And that if they shoot her once, she might not die. And that if they shoot her, no matter how, or if they push her out of the door and not shoot her or miss, or if they do accomplish shooting her, that even though it is going to hurt, it is going to be terrible, that she should just, no matter what happens, submit. And I mean that just right out of the dictionary, totally submit to her dilemma. And allow them to shoot her if they're going to shoot her, and just lie perfectly still in the hopes that they won't shoot her twice or three times. And she had witnessed that the first shooting of the Israeli woman did not kill her initially. In other words, she was twitching. Well, between you and me, the first shot was fatal. But because she had any movement at all in her body, they purposely ran down the stairs and shot her a couple more times. And this young lady was aware of that. So she theorized that if she gets shot, she should just play dead and lie perfectly still, and she may survive that way. Well, the part that I really want to emphasize and talk about is that the initial receptivity allowed for and demanded of me, I mean, what would you do? So it was, the word demand is a terrible word, but it was just a prerequisite that, my God, if a beautiful young person or a beautiful old person or a young child is in jeopardy, would you not hug them? I mean, if you had the ability, would you not hug them? And if you're 50,000 miles away, you'd still hug them. I mean, you would say out loud, I love you in spite of your dilemma, or know that I'm with you. I can't do anything. I can't hold my hand up in front of the gun. I can't beat this terrorist up and not have you be hurt. But while you are being hurt, I am in empathy with you. Would that be, I'm not sure that word, yeah. In other words, at least in empathy with you, and there's a degree of comfort in that. To know that you're at least not totally alone. That somebody or something is aware of your dilemma. Because oftentimes the trauma is emphasized and more traumatic or mostly traumatic by the loneliness aspect of it. That you're lost and you're alone. And that nothing or nobody can help you. And oftentimes people then turn to God. And God, of course, is ready, willing, and able to answer. So with that automatic divine intervention and with a degree, most subtle degree of psychic receptivity, there was that combination hug of that which she received from God and that which she may or may not have perceived from me. But in part of my salvation to dealing with this methodically and still being in tune with this terrible traumatic thing and not going to pieces myself psychologically, the hug from me outwardly was actually returned instantly. You know, to love outwardly, you will automatically, instantly get the love back tenfold. So that did take place. Now, as of this taping, one of the things that I want to say is that the young lady in question is in fact, and that's one of the reasons this subject came up today, is in fact within the Rochester area. And I mentioned this past evening to my wife Elaine that by no means am I in any kind of fear, because I do at times question my faith, but I'm a very faithful person. As I have a high degree of faith. Therefore, if it is to be that she either subconsciously, superconsciously, or on a conscious level becomes aware of a recognition of me being telepathically in tune with her during that time frame, I would not wish for her ever to sensationalize that maybe it wasn't God that hugged me, maybe it was only Tom Sawyer that hugged me. I mean, that would be destructive. That would be not appropriate. And I would wish for that never to happen. I would actually wish for her to, in other words, would it not be better, you say it like that, would it not be better for her to never know that I was telepathically aware of her dilemma during her dilemma, clairvoyantly, psychically, or any other way? She and I met when I went on the Phil Donahue show in the summer of '88. And I met her in the hallway or in the very large area, the lobby of a very swanky hotel, the Swiss Hotel in New York City. I don't recall which one it is right now. And I did not recognize her. I didn't know her name. I thought that, gee, have I met her before? In other words,
Feeling of familiarity.
right. I knew that there was some degree of attachment or familiarity with that person. I'd met over 100,000 people. So I kind of instantly passed it off. Well, maybe she's been to a conference or something like that, or maybe I could have known her from high school or something like that, but it was not appropriate at the time to even question, like walk up and say, "Excuse me, do you recognize me? Do I know you?" There was no need for that at all. So it was very, very casual. And only at such times, since she walked in, I was already in the lobby sitting down, and she walked in and sat a ways away from me and sat down and just sat there as though she was waiting for somebody. Well, when the announcement came publicly that the limousine for the Phil Donahue show was here and that the people, I forgot the words that he said, but he announced that the limousine was there and the what would you call it? The participants, that's a good enough word, thank you. The participants could come to the car now, and as I stood up, she stood up. And with that action, in other words, again, the association on my part psychologically, or logical deductive reasoning says, wait a minute, if she's going to be on the same show, gee, is she a near-death experiencer? To see, I'll have a tendency to actually identify other near-death experiencers without talking to them. In other words, in a crowded room, I may just recognize a certain little glow, if you will, or certain personality characteristic. How do we recognize charisma? All right. So in that capacity, I may or may not recognize, or I may recognize that she's a near-death experiencer. So then I was a little bewildered, and I thought, oh wow, maybe I recognize her because she's had a near-death experience like I have. And again, didn't make anything of it because you can get crazy about stuff like that. So we got into the limousine, and we then sort of introduced each other. And she introduced herself, and she said, are you going to be on the show today? And then she said, did you have a near-death experience? So I just said, yes, I did. And it was just ordinary small talk on the way to the studio, which was only a few minutes' ride. Now, I was dealing with a Tom Sawyer type dilemma situation myself. It was privately and personally, which doesn't have to be part of this tape or the conversation, but it was very extreme. So my concentration was dealing with my own stuff, and that why was I there on the show, what was probably going to take place, and that I was going to talk about something other than near-death experiences, and I was going to use that opportunity to make public something that was extremely worldly important and private and spiritually sensitive and so on, and militaristically secret. So that's what I was concentrating on. Well, just as we finally sat down just before the camera started, she turned to me, and of course, coincidentally, we sat side by side, and she stated that she was very nervous because she had never been on national television before. So I reached over and patted her hand, and she put her hand on top of my hand, and then she said a few sentences, and they were really very unconditionally lovely, and a recognition of, oh, thank you very much, and gee, do you know this or do you know that, and so on. And then as the story developed, as the show started, I then became aware of that she was the young lady aboard the plane. And I had a little apprehension of confronting her. One of the thought processes that I had was that because I've been so openly involved publicly, shall I say, in the scientific and medical research regarding my situation, near-death experiences, and psychic, what people call phenomena, I thought, could it be that Phil Donahue, as clever as he is, knew of my circumstance somehow and knew of her circumstance, and I was going to be confronted by my awareness of her situation, and I was racing through my terrible memory, because I always say consciously I have a very bad memory. I'm not good at remembering dates, and anything a week ago might be a year ago, a month ago in my perception. I have a difficult time with that. So I was racing through my memory. My God, how much have I talked about that? Have I made any of this public? And if so, am I going to be tricked into being embarrassed or something And is she going to suddenly recognize me in some way? In other words, is she, Jackie, going to turn to me and say, I know you, and how can I know you? Or something of that nature. In other words, here I go questioning the faith of all of this stuff and the reality of that. You know, if you are